The bell above the door of the Harmony Diner gave its familiar, friendly jingle, but nobody really heard it anymore. It was just part of the background music of the place, like the hum of the old refrigerator or the constant, gentle sizzle from the grill in the kitchen. It was a Tuesday, which meant the meatloaf special, and the slow, easy rhythm of the evening was settling in. The diner was the kind of place that felt like a warm blanket. The booths had soft, cracked red leather, and the chrome trim on the counter was worn shiny in spots from years of elbows and coffee mugs. The air smelled of toasted bread, strong coffee, and something sweet and cinnamon-y that always seemed to be baking. Most of the people here tonight were regulars. There was an older man with kind eyes and a tweed cap who came every week, sitting in the same corner booth by the window, slowly working his way through a piece of cherry pie. A couple of construction workers, their boots dusty, laughed quietly over plates of steak and eggs. A young mother was trying to convince her little boy to eat just 3 more bites of his macaroni and cheese. And moving between the tables, a constant, calm presence was her. She was a waitress here. To the people in the diner, she was a part of the room itself. She was the person who brought the food, who refilled the coffee cup before you even had to ask, who smiled when you said thank you. She had a quiet way about her. She watched things. She noticed when the old man's cup was empty, and she saw the little boy sneak a green bean to the floor. Her hands were quick and capable, clearing plates without a clatter, writing down orders in a small, neat script. She didn't talk much about herself. When people asked how her day was, she'd say, "Not too bad, thanks," and ask about theirs. They knew her name from her tag, but that was about all. They knew she was reliable, that she worked hard, and that her pie recommendations were always spot on. In their minds, she was the waitress. That was her role in the story of the Harmony Diner out in the far corner of the room. Past the last booth and near the hallway to the restrooms stood another piece of the diner's furniture that nobody paid much mind to anymore. It was an upright piano. Once, maybe 20 or 30 years ago, when the diner first opened, it might have been the heart of the place. You could imagine someone playing cheerful tunes on a Saturday night. Now it just looked tired. Its dark wood was scuffed, and the lid was permanently closed. On top of it sat a droopy potted plant that was doing its best to survive in the dim light, a stack of old menus, and a small chalkboard that listed the weekly soup. A fine layer of dust covered everything, making the black and white keys look fuzzy and gray. The piano was more of a shelf than an instrument. People walked by it a dozen times a night and never gave it a thought. The little boy sometimes banged on the keys if his mom wasn't looking, producing a loud, jarring clunk that made everyone jump. But that was the only sound it ever made. The evening drifted along. The waitress wiped down the counter, her cloth moving in smooth circles. She filled sugar dispensers and watched the clock tick slowly towards closing time. The old man in the corner, the one with the tweed cap, finished his last bite of pie and pushed the plate away with a contented sigh. He'd been coming here for years, longer than she'd worked here. He had a twinkle in his eye and a fondness for gentle teasing Dot as the waitress came by to clear his plate and leave the check. He leaned back and gestured with his thumb towards the dark corner. "You know," he said, his voice warm and raspy, "I've been staring at that old dinosaur all night. Makes me a little sad." He smiled at her. "I remember when old Joe, the first owner, would play a tune or two on it. Nothing fancy, mind you, but it was nice. Gave the place a bit of soul." He chuckled, looking around at the other customers who were starting to listen. "I'll tell you what," he announced, his voice rising just enough to carry across the quiet room. "I'd pay my bill twice over. I'd even wash the dishes. If I could just hear that old thing sing one more time. Sounds better than the silence anyway." A few of the other regulars smiled. The construction guys chuckled. It was a sweet, Sentimental thought from a sweet, sentimental man. It was a nice thing to say, but everyone knew it was just talk. The piano was a piece of the past. The manager, a big, gentle man who was mostly seen through the service window to the kitchen, heard the comment and shook his head with a grin, wiping his hands on his apron. He loved the old man, but the piano was beyond hope. It hadn't been tuned since before he bought the place. The waitress had been standing there, holding the old man's dirty plate. She didn't say anything to his comment. She just gave him her usual small, polite smile and said, "I'll get you some more water." But for a moment, her eyes didn't follow her feet as she turned towards the kitchen. They flicked over to the piano in the corner. They rested on the closed lid, on the dusty keys just visible underneath the soup board. It wasn't a long look, just a second. But in that second, the look on her face changed. It wasn't the polite, attentive mask of the waitress. It was something more complicated. A little distant, a little sad, and then, for just a flash, something sharp and focused dot. It was so quick that if you had blinked, you would have missed it. By the time she pushed through the swinging door into the kitchen, her face was calm and neutral again. The moment passed. The old man's joke lingered in the air for a minute, sparking a short conversation among the remaining customers about how things used to be before it faded away, replaced by the soft clink of cutlery and the low murmur of talk. The diner settled back into its comfortable, quiet rhythm. The waitress came back out with a fresh pitcher of water. She checked on the young mother, offered the construction workers more coffee, which they declined as they got ready to leave. Everything was normal. The piano sat silently in its corner, a forgotten monument. The old man's wish was just a wistful bit of noise, a tiny ripple in the quiet pond of the evening. Soon, it would be time to start wiping down the tables and putting the chairs up. But that one look, that fleeting glance she had given the piano, hung in the air like a held breath. It was a silent, secret response to the old man's public wish. No one had seen it, but something had shifted. A quiet possibility had been acknowledged in the stillness of her own mind. The routine of the night was still intact, but beneath the surface, a thread had been pulled, and everyone, without knowing it, was waiting to see if the whole quiet tapestry of the evening might start to unravel into something completely unexpected. The laughter from the old man's little joke died down, leaving the diner wrapped in its usual comfortable silence. The waitress moved on, collecting empty plates from the construction worker's table with a soft clatter. The sound of the front door opening and closing announced their departure, leaving a cooler draft in their wake that quickly faded. The young mother was gathering up her little boy's crayons, speaking to him in low, tired tones. The evening was winding down, the energy seeping out of the room. The waitress carried the stack of dirty dishes back toward the kitchen. Her movements were automatic, practiced. She pushed through the swinging door with her shoulder, the warm, damp air from the dishwasher hitting her face. She slid the plates onto the stainless steel counter where the cook, a large man with a kind face perpetually flushed from the grill's heat, gave her a nod. He was scrubbing down his station, the water hissing and steaming. "Old-timers getting sentimental again," the cook said, not looking up from his scrubbing. She replied, her voice non-committal. It was her usual sound. She wiped her hands on the towel tucked into her apron string and looked around the kitchen. The work was almost done. Back out in the dining area, the quiet felt heavier now. Only 3 tables were occupied. The old man, still nursing his final cup of coffee, the mother and her now sleepy child, and a young couple in a booth near the front, sharing a slice of chocolate cake, their heads close together. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching out. The old man sighed, a happy, contented sound, and patted his stomach. He caught the waitress's eye as she came back out. "Just the check for me, dear," he said, his voice warm. "Of course," she said, turning to the register. As she printed out the slip, her eyes wandered again, past the old man to the dark shape of the piano. It looked even more forlorn in the dimming light. The potted plant on top seemed to droop a little more. The chalkboard with the soup of the day, cream of broccoli, was slightly crooked. A strange feeling settled in her chest. It wasn't nervousness exactly. It was more like a pull, a physical tug from that corner of the room. The old man's words, asterisk, "I'd pay my bill twice over." To hear that old thing sing, asterisk replayed in her head. But they weren't just his words anymore. They felt like an invitation, or maybe a key, turning slowly in a lock she had kept closed for a very long time. She brought the old man his check. He thanked her, fished out his wallet from his back pocket. Everything was normal, routine, but the routine felt thin, like a sheet of ice over deep water. As he counted out his cash, she found herself walking, not towards the kitchen, not to check on the coffee pot. Her feet carried her, one step in front of the other, across the checked linoleum floor. The sound of her sensible work shoes was soft, but in the quiet it seemed loud. The young mother glanced up, noticing her path, a slight frown of curiosity on her face. The old man, looking up from his wallet, paused, his eyes following her. She was aware of them watching. She felt their gazes like small points of warmth on her back. But the pull was stronger. She reached the piano. For a moment, she just stood in front of it, looking at the clutter on its lid. She reached out and moved the soup board carefully, placing it on the floor beside the piano leg. She lifted the drooping plant, its leaves brushing her wrist, and set it down next to the board. She blew a soft breath across the top of the piano, and a little cloud of dust puffed into the air. Dancing in the light from the overhead lamp, the manager had come to the kitchen doorway, a clean towel in his hands. He watched, his expression one of mild confusion. He opened his mouth as if to say something, maybe to ask if she needed help cleaning back there, but then he closed it. There was an intentness in her posture that stopped him. She pulled out the piano stool. It gave a low, wooden groan of protest. She sat down. The stool was a little too low. She adjusted it, the simple, mechanical turning of the seat breaking the profound silence. The sound was huge in the room now. She was facing the keys. Up close, they were even sadder. Yellowed with age, the ivory cracking in places. The black paint on the sharps, worn down to wood in spots where countless fingers had once pressed. A few crumbs, probably from a long-ago plate of cookies, sat in the crevices between the keys. It was an old, neglected, forgotten thing. She didn't see that. Her eyes were seeing something else. She lifted her hands from her lap. They were good hands, strong from carrying trays, with short, clean nails. But as she held them over the keys, they changed. They weren't a waitress's hands anymore. They became poised, deliberate, alive with a different kind of memory. She took a deep breath, her shoulders rising and falling. It was the first deep breath she'd taken all shift. She let it out slowly, and with it, she seemed to let go of something. The weight of the orders, the smell of grease, the tiredness in her feet. Her face, usually so carefully neutral, softened. A focus came into her eyes, a deep, inward look in the booth. The young couple had stopped eating their cake. They were staring, forks suspended in mid-air. The mother had stopped trying to pack her bag. She just watched, one hand resting on her sleeping son's back. The old man had completely forgotten about his wallet. He sat perfectly still, his tweed cap casting a shadow over his eyes, which were wide and unblinking. The manager in the doorway crossed his arms, not in anger, but in unconscious suspense. The cook, wondering about the silence, peered out from behind him, his scrubbing brush dripping onto the floor. The waitress lowered her hands, her right thumb pressed down on a single key. It was a middle C. The note that came out was awful. It was a dull, dead thunk. It was slightly out of tune, and the felt inside the piano was old and hard. It was the sound everyone expected. A flat, disappointing sound. The old man's face fell, just a little. It was just a dusty old piano after all, but she didn't flinch. She didn't seem surprised. She listened to the note as it faded into the wood of the piano and the air of the diner. She nodded to herself, as if she'd just been introduced to a strange, rusty tool and was figuring out how it worked. She pressed another key, then another, a slow, quiet sequence of notes. Each one was a little off, a little sour, but she was listening, her head tilted. Then she pressed her foot down on the left pedal. She leaned her body forward, just slightly. Her shoulders relaxed, and she began to play Dot. It wasn't a loud song. It started slowly, gently. A few simple, clear notes that rose and fell like a question. But there was a richness to them now. She wasn't just hitting the keys. She was touching them, her fingers applying pressure with a subtle, knowing care. The melody that emerged was sad and beautiful. It was familiar to some, though no one could place it just then. It was the kind of music that didn't belong in a diner. It belonged in a grand, silent hall, or in the quiet of a solitary room late at night. The dusty, out-of-tune piano resisted at first, but then it seemed to wake up. Under her hands, the dead thunks became rounded tones. The sour notes were woven into the music so that they sounded intentional, like a bittersweet memory. The simple melody grew more complex, her left hand joining in with soft, deep chords that supported the right hand's gentle wandering dot. No one moved. No one breathed. The young mother had her free hand pressed to her mouth. The old man had tears welling in his eyes, not from sadness, but from a shock of beauty he had not expected to ever feel again in his favorite booth. The manager's arms had uncrossed, his hands hanging loose at his sides. The cook just stared, his mouth slightly open. She was somewhere else. Her eyes were fixed on the keys, but they weren't really seeing them. They were seeing the music. A slight, unconscious smile touched the corners of her mouth, not of happiness, but of deep concentration and a kind of release. Her body swayed, just a little, with the rise and fall of the phrases. The waitress was gone. In her place was someone they had never met, someone who spoke a language of feeling they all understood, but had never heard spoken here in this place of coffee and pie. The quiet of the diner was no longer an empty quiet. It was full, charged, and waiting for the next note to fall. The simple, sad melody didn't stay simple for long. It was like watching a seed crack open and grow into a tree in the space of a minute. The waitress's hands, which had seemed so ordinary, became something else entirely. They moved with a quiet certainty, her fingers dancing over the yellowed keys, but it wasn't a frantic dance. It was graceful and strong, like water finding its path down a hill. The tune grew deeper, fuller. Her left hand began to walk across the lower keys, laying down a foundation of rich, dark chords that made the air in the diner feel thicker. Each chord vibrated through the old piano's body and out into the room, a physical feeling you could feel in your chest. Then her right hand soared above it, spinning a thread of heartbreakingly clear notes. The music swelled and then fell to a whisper, telling a story without any words. It was a story of longing, of quiet rooms and distant memories, of something beautiful and just out of reach. The old piano fought her at first. A few keys stuck, making a soft thump instead of a note. One of the high notes was painfully sharp, like a crack in a window. But she didn't stop. She didn't even seem to notice as a problem. She wove those sounds into the music. The stuck note became a moment of hesitation in the story. The sharp note became a cry of feeling. She was not just playing the piano. She was having a conversation with it. She was listening to its old, tired voice and finding the beauty that was still hidden inside, but the change in her was total. The woman sitting at the piano bore no resemblance to the waitress who had served pie and coffee all evening. Her back was straight, but not stiff. Her shoulders moved with the flow of the music. Her face, usually so carefully blank, was alive. Her eyes were focused on some distant point in her mind, seeing the shapes of the music as she built them. There was a softness around her mouth, a deep focus in her brow. All the tiredness from being on her feet all day was gone. She was fully, completely in this one thing. In the booth, the old man forgot he was holding his wallet. His hand slowly lowered to the table, the bills fluttering down unnoticed. He didn't wipe the tear that escaped from the corner of his eye and traced a path down his wrinkled cheek. He just stared, his mouth slightly open. This was the song he had joked about. This was 100 times, 1,000 times more than he had ever dreamed. The dusty dinosaur in the corner wasn't just singing. It was pouring out its soul, and a woman he thought he knew was its voice. The young mother had her arm wrapped tightly around her sleeping son, but she wasn't looking at him. She was staring at the waitress. The music touched a place in her that was tired from long days and messy nights. It wasn't loud or angry. It was understanding. It felt like a kind of gentle sadness that made her own worries feel seen and somehow lighter. She held her boy closer, resting her cheek on his hair. Listening out at the front, the young couple had pulled apart from their close talk. They were sitting side by side now, facing the piano. A forgotten cake sat between them. The young man had reached over and taken his girlfriend's hand, and she was holding on to it tightly. They weren't looking at each other. They were both caught in the same spell. The music filled the space between them with something more powerful than words. From the kitchen doorway, the manager stood frozen. The dish towel hung limp from his hand. All his practical thoughts about closing time, about the dirty grill, about the inventory vanished from his head. He knew this woman. He had hired her. He knew she was reliable and quiet. He had no idea there was a whole universe inside of her. He watched her hands, amazed at their speed and precision, at the sheer force of feeling they were pulling out of the old instrument. A slow shake of his head was his only movement. A silent "I had no idea" behind him. The cook had stepped fully out of the kitchen. He leaned against the doorframe, his big arms crossed over his stained apron. A man who spent his life in the clash and sizzle of the kitchen, he was now utterly captured by the quiet complexity flowing from the corner. He didn't know classical music from pop music, but he knew what hard work and skill looked like. He saw the intense concentration on her face, the absolute control in her fingers. He let out a low, appreciative breath. "Will you listen to that?" he murmured, so quiet only the manager could hear. The music built. It wasn't getting louder in a crashing way, but denser, more powerful. The waitress's right hand flew across the keys in a run of notes, so fast they sounded like a shower of silver drops. Then, just as quickly, her hands came together for a series of deep, resonant chords that made the piano's wood hum. The little potted plant on the floor beside her seemed to shiver. The light from the overhead lamp caught the dust still hanging in the air, making it look like gold dust swirling around her. She was breathing with the music now. You could see her shoulders rise with a deep breath during a quiet pause, and then release as she poured the feeling into the next phrase. A lock of hair had come loose from the simple tie at the back of her head and fell beside her face. She didn't push it back. For the people watching, time stopped. The diner was no longer a diner. The red booths, the chrome counter, the smell of old coffee, it all faded away. The only real things were the woman at the piano and the river of sound she was creating. It was a private thing they were all witnessing, something so personal, it almost felt wrong to watch. But they couldn't look away. They were seeing a secret, a hidden door flung wide open. The old man thought of his wife, gone 10 years now, and the way she used to hum while she gardened. The young mother thought of the dreams she had before her son was born, not with regret, but with a strange new ache. The young couple felt the vast, scary, wonderful future stretching out in front of them. The manager remembered why he bought this old place, dreaming of it being a haven, a spot of warmth. The music touched something different in each of them, but it touched them all. The piece was moving towards its end. The flurry of notes settled. The melody from the beginning returned, but it was changed now. Older, wiser, soaked in all the emotion that had come in between. It was a return home after a long journey. Her hands moved slowly, gently, pressing each key with a loving finality. The notes hung in the quiet air, one after another, pure and clear dot, and then it was over. Her hands lifted from the keys and came to rest softly in her lap. The last note shimmered in the silence, vibrating in the strings inside the old piano, and then it faded, leaving behind a quiet so deep and complete it was like a new kind of sound. No one moved. No one made a peep. They were all still trapped in the world she had built, afraid that a single clap or a cough would shatter it into a million pieces. They just stared at the woman on the piano stool, her head now bowed slightly, the loose hair curtaining her face. The waitress was back, but they could no longer see her the same way. The air in the Harmony Diner was different. It was charged, fragile, and utterly changed. The silence after the last note was a living thing. It wasn't an empty silence. It was thick, full of the echo of the music and the shock of everyone in the room. For a long moment, nobody even breathed. They were all suspended, caught between the world that had just been created and the ordinary diner they knew. The waitress sat perfectly still on the piano stool, her hands folded in her lap. She stared at the keys, now silent, as if she too was surprised by what had just come out of them. The loose strand of hair still rested against her cheek. Slowly, she lifted a hand and pushed it back behind her ear. It was a small, human gesture, and it broke the spell. Started with the old man. A sound escaped him, not a word, but a kind of soft, choked sob that was pure wonder. Then his hands came together. It wasn't a loud, dramatic clap. It was slow and deliberate, like he was waking himself up. The sound of his palms meeting was sharp in the quiet room. That single clap was the spark. The young mother joined in, her eyes shining with tears she didn't bother to wipe away. Then the young couple, leaping to their feet, their applause suddenly loud and enthusiastic. From the kitchen doorway, the manager started clapping, a big, beaming smile breaking across his face. The cook, not one for shows of emotion, just nodded his head firmly and slapped his broad hand against his thigh in a steady, solid beat of approval. The applause filled the diner, bouncing off the tiles and the window glass. It was a storm of sound, completely different from the music, but just as powerful. It was gratitude, astonishment, and a burst of joy all mixed together. The waitress finally turned on the stool to face them. The deep focus was gone from her face, replaced by a look of slight bewilderment, as if she had just walked out of a dark room into bright sunlight. A faint blush crept up her neck. She gave a small, awkward smile, more of a wince, and dipped her head. Unused to being the center of such attention, the old man was the first to find his voice. He struggled to his feet, using the table for support, his tweed cap nearly falling off. "My dear girl," he said, his voice shaky but clear. "My dear, dear girl. That was the most beautiful thing I have heard in 20 years. He shook his head, unable to find more words, and just kept clapping. The manager finally moved. He walked out from behind the counter, his eyes never leaving her. He went not to the piano, but first to the coffee pot. He grabbed a clean mug, filled it to the brim with fresh coffee, and added a splash of cream, just the way she always took it on her break. Then he walked over and held it out to her. She looked at the mug, then up at his face. He was smiling, a real warm smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I think," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear over the dying applause, "you might need this more than any of us tonight." She took the mug, her fingers wrapping around the warmth. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you," the manager said firmly. Then the questions started tumbling out, not from him, but from everyone else, all at once. "How did you do that?" the young woman from the couple asked, her voice full of awe. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Her boyfriend added. The old man just kept repeating, "But how? Here? All this time?" The waitress took a small sip of the coffee, using it as a moment to gather herself. The attention was a heavy weight. She set the mug down on top of the piano, next to a dusty spot. She looked at their faces, all turned toward her, full of open curiosity and newfound respect. I just play," she started, her voice low. She cleared her throat. "I've played since I was little. My grandmother had an old piano, even older than this one." She glanced at the instrument beside her, and her look was no longer one of dismissal, but of a kind of kinship. "But that's professional," the manager said, stating what everyone was thinking. "That's concert stuff." She shrugged one shoulder, a little self-consciously. "I went to school for it. For music. The conservatory in the city." She said the name, a famous and intimidating place they had all heard of, but never known anyone who actually attended. A collective gasp seemed to go through the small crowd. The cook let out a low whistle. "So you're a musician?" the young mother asked. The waitress gave a small, sad smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm trying to be. It's a hard thing to be." She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had just created magic, now resting on her waitress apron. "It costs a lot. For lessons, for practice rooms, to live. The auditions, there." She trailed off, not wanting to complain. "This job pays the rent. It lets me do the other thing." The room was quiet again, but now it was a quiet of understanding. The pieces were clicking into place. The quietness, the observation, the way she seemed to carry a separate world inside her, it all made sense. She wasn't just a waitress. She was a musician who was waiting tables. It was a small difference in words, but a huge difference in how they saw her. The old man nodded slowly, wisdom in his eyes. "You're keeping the dream alive," he said softly. "Doing what you have to do." She met his gaze and nodded. "Something like that. And you just kept it to yourself?" the manager asked, not accusingly, but with amazement at another small shrug. "It never came up, and—" She looked around the diner, at the comfortable, ordinary surroundings. "This doesn't exactly seem like the place for chopping." "But it is," the old man insisted, his voice strong. "It is now. Beauty belongs anywhere people are listening. And we were listening, my dear. We were all listening." The manager's mind, ever practical, was starting to turn. He looked at the old piano, then at her, then at the faces of his customers. An idea was forming. But first, he had another question. Why tonight? After all this time, why play tonight? She was silent for a moment, thinking. She looked at the old man. "Because you said you wanted to hear it sing again," she said simply. "And I guess I wanted to remember what that felt like. To just play, without it being for a grade or an audition. To play for this." She gestured vaguely, meaning the room, the people, the feeling in the air. The young mother spoke up, her voice gentle. What was the song? It was so sad, but so pretty. It's by Chopin, the waitress said. A nocturne. It's like a night song. Piece for quiet, dark hours. She said the full name, and it sounded like a piece of poetry. The old man repeated it slowly, committing it to memory. I'll have to look that up, he said. You don't need to, the young man from the couple said. We just heard it. The manager finally stepped forward, putting a hand on the piano's lid. This old thing, he said, patting the wood. I think it deserves a little respect after that. And a tune-up. He looked directly at her. And I think we could all use a little more of that around here. What if we made this a regular thing? A Friday night thing? You play. We'll listen. I'll even pay you for the extra hour. Proper musician rates, not waitress rates. The waitress's eyes widened. She opened her mouth, then closed it. The offer hung in the air, unexpected and generous. It wasn't a big concert hall, but it was a room full of people who wanted to hear her. It was a chance to play, really play, without the crushing pressure of a panel of judges. It was a connection. Before she could answer, the old man slammed his hand on the table, making the sugar shaker jump. I'll be your first regular. Every Friday. I'll bring my friends. A laugh went around the room, light and happy. The waitress looked from the manager's hopeful face to the old man's excited one to the smiling customers. The nervous blush was gone, replaced by the first real, warm, open smile any of them had ever seen from her. It transformed her face. I think, she said, her voice stronger now, I'd like that very much. The manager grinned. Then it settled. He picked up her coffee mug and handed it back to her. Now finish this. You've still got some tables to wipe down before close. The familiar, ordinary instruction broke the last of the tension. Everyone laughed again. The spell was finally fully broken, but the room was left brighter for it. The waitress took her mug, took a long drink, and stood up. She gave the piano keys one last, gentle touch, a silent thank you, before she walked back towards the counter to get her cleaning cloth. But as she walked, people didn't look away. They watched her go with new eyes. They saw the waitress, yes, but they also saw the musician. And for the first time, so did she. The following Friday, the Harmony Diner felt different long before the sun went down. There was a buzz in the air, a quiet hum of expectation. The old piano in the corner was the undeniable star of the room. It gleamed under the lights, its dark wood polished to a soft shine, the yellowed keys looking cleaner, though still worn. The potted plant was gone, replaced by a simple black music stand. The manager, true to his word, had found a tuner, an old friend who worked on church organs, and spent a good part of Wednesday with him in the corner, listening to chords and strange wrenches turning. The piano would never be perfect, but it was awake now, its voice clear and ready. The waitress went about her usual shift, but the routine had a new texture. When she refilled the old man's coffee, he didn't just say thank you. He leaned in and said, with a twinkle, saving my best listening ears for tonight. The construction workers, who are back for an early dinner, asked if she'd be playing something with a bit of energy. She smiled and said she'd think about it. The simple exchanges had layers now. She was no longer just the person who brought the food. She was the person who held the key to the evening's magic dot. As closing time for the kitchen approached, something remarkable happened. Instead of people leaving, more began to arrive. The old man came back, bringing his sister, a woman with bright eyes and a kind face. The young couple from that night returned, holding hands. News, the kind that doesn't need the internet, had traveled through the neighborhood. A few new faces trickled in, a woman from the flower shop down the street, a retired teacher who lived above the pharmacy. They ordered slices of pie and cups of coffee their eyes flicking to the piano, then to the waitress in her apron. The manager watched it all with a mix of pride and wonder. He had pushed a few tables back to make a little more space. He felt a nervous energy himself, like he was putting on a show for the first time. Finally, the kitchen closed. The grill was off. The last of the dinner plates were cleared. The waitress disappeared into the back and came out a few minutes later. She hadn't changed her clothes, but she had taken off her apron. She carried a small, well-worn folder of sheet music. This small act, the removal of the apron, felt significant. It was the line between one job and the other. A hush fell, gentler than the stunned silence of the first night, but just as full of anticipation. She walked to the piano, placed her folder on the stand, and sat down. She took a moment, her hands in her lap, just breathing. The room breathed with her. Then she began to play. It wasn't the same sad, beautiful nocturne from before. This was something different. It was still classical, still intricate and lovely, but it had a playful energy, a dancing lightness that made the old man's foot start tapping softly on the linoleum. She moved from that piece into another, something softer and more flowing. She played for 20 minutes, a small concert for a dozen people in a diner. When she finished, the applause was warm and heartfelt, not shocked, but deeply appreciative. Someone whispered, "Bravo!" And that was how it began. Friday nights at the Harmony Diner became a thing. A small, cherished thing. The manager kept his promise. He paid her for her time at the piano, a separate envelope that felt different in her hand. More importantly, he supported her. He'd listen to her practice a tricky passage during a slow afternoon, offering a thumbs up from behind the counter. He started a little tip jar on the piano, not for her, but with a sign that said, "For piano maintenance and sheet music." The regulars loved it, often putting in more than the cost of their coffee. The change in the waitress was slow, but profound. The quietness was still there, but it was no longer a wall. It was a calm center. She began to talk a little more. She'd tell the old man the story behind a piece she was learning. She asked the young mother how her son was doing in school. She was still herself, but she was more present. The music had opened a door inside her, and through it, she could connect with the people around her more easily. The diner changed, too. It became more than a place for a quick meal. On Fridays, it was a destination. People came for the community as much as for the music. They'd chat between pieces, discuss what they'd heard, recommend songs for next week. The retired teacher once brought in a book of sonatas she thought the waitress might like. The cook, who always stayed to listen from his doorway, surprised everyone one night by asking if she knew any Scott Joplin. The next Friday, she opened with a lively, joyful ragtime piece that had him grinning from ear to ear, and the whole room clapping along. For the waitress, the diner became her sanctuary. The high-pressure world of auditions and cutthroat competitions was still out there, and she still faced it. But now she had this, a place where she played for the love of it, where a wrong note was met with a sympathetic smile, not a deducted point, where the reward was the old man's contented sigh, the manager's proud nod, the feeling of a room full of people sharing a beautiful moment. It gave her courage. She started auditioning with a new kind of calm, not because she needed to escape the diner, but because she carried its warmth with her. One chilly autumn Friday, nearly a year after that first unexpected night, something special happened. The diner was more packed than usual. Word had spread far. The waitress had prepared a longer program, a mix of old favorites and a challenging new piece she'd mastered. She played beautifully, losing herself in the music as she always did. At the end of her final piece, as the applause died down, the old man stood up. He was holding a small, wrapped gift. He walked to the piano, his steps slow but sure. "For you, my dear," he said, his voice thick with emotion. From all of us. Inside was a beautiful, leather-bound book for sheet music, and tucked into the front cover was a card. It wasn't a store-bought card. It was handmade, signed by every regular, and even by the cook and the manager. On it, they had all written a few words. The old man had written, "Asterisk, thank you for teaching an old man to listen again." The young mother wrote, "Asterisk, your music is the calm in my storm." The manager had simply put, "Asterisk, proud of you." "Kid," asterisk, she read the card, her eyes filling with tears she didn't try to hide. She looked out at the room, at these people who had become her unexpected family. "I don't know what to say," she whispered into the microphone the manager had recently bought. "You don't have to say anything," the manager called out from behind the counter, wiping a glass a little too vigorously. "Just play us one more." So she did. She played a simple, sweet lullaby. It was a thank you, a lullaby for the diner itself, for the quiet dreams it held. The brilliant pianist still worked days in her apron. The waitress still had calluses from her tray and worries about rent. But the line between the two had blurred into something new. She was both, and she was whole. The dusty old piano in the corner was no longer a relic. It was the heart of the place, a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary songs start in the quietest, most ordinary corners. And everyone who heard them is changed, just a little, forever.